this webinar is being recorded, which already arose some concern, in particular regarding the so-called Marshall Tweeto. And I think you all know whom I'm talking about, which is a nickname of Prime Minister Janša. I just saw in some, actually in many newspapers, a lot of discussions around the Janša government, be it on media freedom, be it of the rule of law, be it also of the reactions of the EPP in the European Parliament, which I find very interesting, because years ago, when the Hungarian presidency took over, I remember that very well. We had been trying to get some resolutions on Hungary, and the Orban party, being part of the EPP, made it possible that not much had happened. So it will be very interesting to compare what's happening in Slovenia at the moment. We sort of tend to compare it to Hungary and Poland, even though it is indeed not the same. It's very important to say there is media pluralism. There are very, very courageous, active journalist organizations, which I believe are very strong, stronger than in other countries. But there is also an illiberal trend, which is indeed happening in that country. And I think our excellent speaker will provide you with a little bit more of information on these illiberal trends, also referring to some of the recommendations we have put at the end of the report, and which we are happy to discuss with all of you after the short introductions of our speakers. So thank you very much to all of you for your great interest, and I give the floor to Jamie.
So in my section, I'm just going to kind of focus in on one of the key elements from our report, which was public service media, looking at the Slovenian press agency, obviously, but also the public broadcaster. And I think, you know, the kind of the pressures that these two institutions have really been under since the government of Janša returned to power were a really kind of key and alarming issue for us to explore and, you know, understand a little bit better from our mission. And as we've outlined in the report, I think over the last 9 or so months, the Government Communication Office has really set about to destabilize and financially drain the STR. I think it's done this by kind of manufacturing this contractual dispute, essentially, through which EUCOM has twice suspended the monthly financing of STA and now kind of refused to sign a new contract. This issue has been messy, it's been quite fast changing, and it's also been very complex. But the bottom line is that despite explicit legal obligations for the government to provide sustainable funding to the STA under 2 different laws, it's now been left without state funding, any state funding at all, since December 2020, which is really seriously jeopardizing its immediate survival. Renate also, already mentioned it. I think a key context and thing to understand here is that the STR really is the lifeblood of the Slovenian media market. It serves a key public service mission and provides breaking and kind of international and national news, both in English and Slovenian, with its articles then being republished in a lot of other media outlets. One really good explanation we heard during the mission was that the STR is really a key artery for the media ecosystem. And if you shut it off, you really cut off a circulation to the entire system. So it's clear just how integral the STA is. So as well as this kind of funding crisis, to make matters worse, while this dispute has been underway, STA's management has also come under sustained and quite serious attacks from the Prime Minister in particular, who's called for its Director General to be dismissed, and even accused him of being the collaborator in the murder of a former colleague. And this was something we heard repeated in the mission by people within the Government Communication Office and another kind of people from the government as well. STA has also been branded a national disgrace on Twitter. And I think these kind of very personalized attacks have really, for us, really crystallized the attitude and the stance that the government has towards the STA. During this time, there's been a crowdsourcing campaign, which has raised, I think, over 274,000 euros to pay the salaries of STA staff. But these are, I think, due to run out in around August. So time really is running out, and it's vital that the funding is resumed as quickly as possible. Over the last few months, we've seen repeated calls from the European Commission for the government to reinstate the funding. And just this week, with its president, Ursula von der Leyen, in Slovenia, those same calls were made. And yet the deadline continues right now. After the mission ended, the government passed a decree which kind of gave EUCOM increased access to internal business data and financial records. And then on the eve of the presidency, it then instructed EUCOM to recommence the financing. But this was on the condition that the STA drop its legal action against EUCOM. So I think while the move is welcome, we have serious concerns about the conditionality of the agreement. And again, the possibility that it will really erode its independence. And I think until, it has to be stressed that ultimately until a contract for sustainable funding is signed and until pen is put to paper, the survival of the STA and its public service journalism remain in jeopardy. I think concerningly, it wasn't just the STA. We also met with people from the public broadcaster. And it's clear that since Janša's return to power, Radio Television Slovenia has also come under renewed pressure, both through budget cuts and through harassment of its staff, both online and offline. And again, as with STA, Laurens is going to speak a little bit more about this, but these kind of alarming Twitter attacks and smears, with the public broadcaster being branded a totalitarian, media killer, and even accused of trying to overthrow the government through its coverage. So this has been really dialing up the pressure. This is nothing new, it has to be said. The Prime Minister and particular ministers have been long critics of the broadcaster and its license fee. But since returning to power, the PM has again called for citizens not to pay the license fee, alleging bias. And this was something we heard again and again and again, both from pro-government journalists, but also people within ministries, criticizing the broadcaster as being biased, left-wing communist. And I think these ideological grievances really became clear when the ministry brought forward these legislative changes, which would have, if passed, left the public broadcaster in a very financially and institutionally weaker position. And luckily, those changes were not passed due to severe opposition, and it was confirmed that this wouldn't be reintroduced during this parliament. But I think just to kind of conclude, taking these two issues together, the STA and the public broadcaster, what I think we've seen is quite an aggressive attempt to exert greater control of government over the country's public service media in the last 14 months. And this has been done using a kind of mix of legal and administrative pressure, as well as on top, kind of mixed in these continuous smears and attempts to discredit and undermine the integrity and the independence of these two institutions. And this is worrying for two reasons. Most obviously, this is happening during a pandemic when impartial and trusted news from public service media has been more important than ever in creating this shared reality. And for the second reason, these kind of attempts by governments, when they come to power, to first pass legislative changes, but then also to increase government control over public service media, it's really one of the hallmarks of the strategy that we've seen employed both in Hungary and in Poland, where liberal governments have completely eroded independence of these broadcasters over the last 5 to 10 years, essentially distorting and transforming them into communication channels of the ruling party. So to see elements of this kind of being replicated in Slovenia is extremely worrying. On a positive note, right now the public broadcaster remains unchanged. The draft legislative proposals have been shelved, and the support and solidarity I think we saw during the mission, both from the journalistic community, but also the public for the STA has been strong, and that's been very uplifting to see. But those concerns remain. STA, its fate is still uncertain, and I think we will be watching extremely closely and making this a key priority for a follow-up mission to Slovenia, to Ljubljana, when we do it later in the year.
Thank you, Jamie. Thank you for also, I forgot to say that at the beginning, that the idea is to have this advocacy mission, which I think will be very important to come up with the list of recommendations you see in the report, to discuss it with stakeholders and to find solutions. Because the idea, I just want to add that, of this mission report is not to blame and shame. No, at all. It's not to even polarize the situation further. It's to come up with a constructive plan to help journalists to do their work, and not more and not less. So with that, having said that, Laurens, I give you the floor, and maybe you can shed a bit of more light on really the issues around safety and attacks against journalists. What is happening there? What do you feel the ECPMF and all media freedom organizations and stakeholders can and should do? Thank you.
So yeah, as you already mentioned during your introduction and also mentioned by Jamie, really defining feature of Janša's current government has been the aggressive use of social media by public officials, including prominently, of course, the Prime Minister himself, to insult and demean journalists with whom he disagrees. They're called liars, propagators of fake news, and much worse. During our fact-finding mission, when we questioned government officials about this use of social media by the PM, they defended his comments, saying Mr. Janša is simply exercising his right to free speech and that he has no other option than to use social media to counter the so-called mainstream media bias, or they play down the impact of the tweets, saying that they are trivial. This point of view was strongly rejected by multiple journalists with whom we spoke. They said that not only are these tweets a form of undue government pressure, but that they also act as a signpost for followers of the Prime Minister and other public officials to then attack and harass critics online. Women journalists we've seen have suffered disproportionately from this increasing hostility against the media. And we heard really harrowing tales of misogynistic abuse to which they are subjected, involving their appearance, their age and family, and including rape and death threats. Overall, journalists told us that they feel online threats are not taken seriously enough by prosecutors, and indeed indictments over hateful comments directed at journalists are extremely rare. We heard many concerns also over the safety of journalists online and offline. And indeed, in our monitoring, we've seen an uptick in the number of physical attacks on media workers in this past year in Slovenia. Now, in terms of what needs to be done to address this, we'd make the following recommendations. First and foremost, the Slovenian government and its members should really lead the way in improving public discourse and reducing this toxicity. They should halt their hostile and dangerous rhetoric against journalists and refrain from efforts to discredit, demean, vilify, and so on, online and offline. And secondly, all online and offline intimidation, threats, also physical attacks and acts of vandalism against media must be publicly condemned and properly investigated and prosecuted, especially in the case of misogynistic threats against women journalists. A second key feature of the current government that I'd like to address has been its efforts to exert greater control over the commercial media landscape, to add sort of the other side of the coin to Jamie's presentation on public service media, where we've seen attempts to exert greater control to suppress criticism and influence coverage under the guise of a purported need to rebalance. For instance, we heard concerns from many stakeholders about attempts to subjugate critical reporting at Media House Pro Plus. Multiple reports suggest that during a secret meeting between the now deceased Petr Kellner and Prime Minister Janša shortly after Kellner's PPF group acquired the company, the Prime Minister complained about editorial policies. And indeed, observers have noted since then subtle changes in scheduling and presentation of political reports on Pop TV and Canal A news programs, whose news outputs are now overseen by a Prague-based editorial board that was established by the parent company. The government also uses the allocation of state funding to undermine independent reporting and to reward its cheerleaders. In the 2021 annual tender for co-financing of media programs, the Ministry of Culture left out 2 daily newspapers, investigative media, and 5 special status radio stations, all of which had previously been labeled as left-wing or politically biased. On the other side, we see state subsidies were increased markedly for media founded by SDS members, owned by Hungarian business people, or aligned with the Catholic Church, which is where we find the strongest basis of SDS support. These choices were defended by officials with whom we met, who said that the fund's allocation was aimed at fostering greater diversity in an unbiased market, by paraphrase. But from other stakeholders, we heard concerns about the narrowness of the selection criteria and also the system of appointment of the advisory commission, most of which members have links or affiliations with the government. There's other ways as well in which SDS has sought to strengthen and amplify its own network of pro-government outlets, many of which were originally co-founded and funded by party members and retain a close relationship. These media display an extreme lack of objectivity and professionalism. Many also publish racist and homophobic opinion pieces and engage in personalized smears and attacks on prominent journalists and Slovenian opposition politicians. We identified a series of articles in these outlets that go well beyond what would be considered reasonable criticism and political opinion making. Although the viewer and readership of many of these outlets remains low, their reach is boosted with regular exclusive interviews with government members, retweeting of their contents by leading party figures, and so on and so forth. Additionally, one can also observe advertisements from state-owned companies on really small pro-government portals with tiny readership figures. In yet another example, there's the questionable reorganization of the TV channel listings by the state-owned Telekom Slovenia, headed by a former SDS mayoral candidate. Overall, what we're seeing is really an attempt to shift viewer and readership into these pro-government governmental outlets' reach. To address this problem, we're making two main recommendations. One is that state-controlled advertising shouldn't be used to punish independent outlets or reward those who are cheerleaders of the government. The Ministry of Culture should be tasked with investigating the use of public money to fund party-affiliated media. And second, in relation to the Ministry of Culture's co-financing tender, this should be reviewed to ensure that special status media have sustainable funding, and to reform the current assessment criteria and the system of appointment of the Expert Advisory Commission. I'll hand it back to Renate with this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laurens. A lot of food for thought, actually, and it shows it's not only the star. There is a very, it seems, a global approach to changing the media landscape, and we haven't been able to find statistics on self-censorship, but of course, it also shows that self-censorship in the more traditional media is on the increase, while what you just explained shows there is a shift. Tim, last not least, you from Press Freedom Unlimited maybe can give us another perspective from what you learned for the mission, what has been the major problems for you also regarding ownership structures, transparency, and independence. Thank you.
I'll in my part focus a little bit on the government narrative that is used to justify these actions that Jamie and Laurens detailed, including the pre-existence weaknesses that we did detect and that are alluded there, that have increased vulnerability in the Slovenian media sector, as well as the wider EU context that this is taking place in. And of course, I'll also note our relevant recommendations, as well as some positive points that we also definitely did find. I'll try to keep it relatively short so that we maintain some time for questions afterwards from those in the audience, so that we can delve further into the parts that you are most interested to hear more in. Well, first of all, government representatives in conversations with us and generally in public tend to justify their actions by employing a narrative that the media landscape, the word has already been mentioned, needs to be rebalanced. They allude to biased media, which is controlled by a close-knit network of staunch opponents to the government. They also give examples here of things that go wrong in the Slovenian media landscape also before the current government came to power. And we did find some pre-existing issues in the Slovenian media sector, but rather than improve the situation, the government has, in our findings, instead exploited these weaknesses. Pre-existing issues range from breaches of editorial independence, particularly where the owners of media outlets have interests in other industries, and then particularly those tied to lucrative state contracts. direct and indirect influence can be observed there in terms of not touching sensitive topics as one of the lightest forms. Furthermore, a lack of oversights of local media funded by municipalities has been mentioned, including by some of the critical journalists that we interviewed themselves, who mentioned that this has been a longer problem, but again, that the current government has gone several steps further in promoting pro-government media at the expense of other media. Furthermore, like in many countries, declining revenues in the media sector have increased vulnerability of media outlets of becoming dependent on wealthy owners, and this has also threatened professional standards. Again, I would like to stress that we found that rather than remedying the situation, the government has instead gone several steps further in undermining these forms of in undermining editorial independence and promoting pro-government media. In the case of the STA that Jamie has gone into already, for instance, government spokespersons that we met indicated that the proposed legal changes that they are currently trying to pass were necessary to combat political control. But when we look at these proposals, they would actually result in greater political control. Furthermore, rather than structural weaknesses, these examples of pre-existing problems are framed as part of an overarching plot by a network of communist or communist-aligned elites. Having heard from multiple sides, our conclusion is therefore that the governing SDS party is engaged in efforts to self-servingly brand the press as ideologically driven to disrupt public trust in critical media. We therefore call upon the Slovenian government instead to recognize that the role that independent journalism, critical reporting, play in holding power to account in any democratic society, and to take steps to halt deterioration of media freedom. Specifically, to work with journalist organizations and civil society to establish stronger institutional safeguards against political meddling in public service media, as well as generally oversight bodies, and to support the journalist community to improve self-regulation. It's important, I think that's the overarching message here in a matter of paradigm on media, that leading politicians acknowledge critical media as a legitimate check on executive power in any functioning democracy. Instead, current rhetoric talks of critical media as a struggle between media and politics, a zero-sum game where either one or the other wins. This is not conducive to a healthy relation where both contribute to the success of democratic society. To put it in the wider EU context, this rhetoric on critical media is something that the Slovenian government has in common with other countries where press freedom is under pressure, notably Poland and Hungary. This connection is concerning as we are worried about this model spreading. As Jamie and Laurens have already pointed out, the Slovenian media sector is not yet in the dire straits that it is in these countries, but we're worried about the same logic being applied to the media sector, as well as the first steps there. The playbook that the Slovenian government follows seems to be one inspired by Orban in Hungary as well. Namely, first of all, the creation of a party media system, which had started already before the current prime minister came to power last year. Secondly, the delegitimization or attacking of any critical media voices. Thirdly, undermining editorial independence so that large outlets do not publish critical pieces. And as a result of that, mainstream media lose their credibility among the public. Fourth, to promote the narrative that there is no independent journalism, there's only left-wing activism and right-wing activism, a narrative that we heard government figures allude to in conversations with us as well, but that they are definitely spreading in public. And this narrative is made easier to spread when existing weaknesses do not get addressed. So we do call upon the media sector in Slovenia and everywhere to be to remain vigilant. But lastly, this narrative then legitimizes their actions and allows pro-government media to publish blatant propaganda from, again, this idea that independent journalism isn't even the goal anymore, but rather countering so-called left-wing activism with right-wing activism. While media freedom is being eroded, the state of media pluralism in Slovenia is still far removed from the examples of Poland and Hungary. But more important, and very importantly, there are some positive points to note in that there are many, many of the independent media professionals that we spoke to are also concerned about not wanting to end up in the same situation as media in Hungary. As a result, there have been clear examples of solidarity within the independent media community and pushback from civil society, as well as a willingness to defend independent media by the Slovenian public. These are signs that were weaknesses in the other examples that we mentioned before years ago. So it's heartening to see that the threat is taken seriously by the independent journalism community in Slovenia, and that there is some pushback. But we also call upon European institutions to ensure that any reforms to media legislation are fully in line with EU law and international standards, and to scrutinize the work of Slovenia's media regulator. Furthermore, we call upon them to support independent and investigative journalism in Slovenia and accelerate the establishment of an EU directive to counter SLAPs. With those recommendations, I'll give the word back to Renate and hope that we have some time left over also to answer some of your questions.
I think this gave us another dimension of the complexity, but also of the seriousness of the situation indeed. We keep saying we are not there yet, but I think all the symptoms, all the trends go in the wrong direction. Having said that, I would really like to open now the floor to some of the participants. We have a bit of time, and if you do so, please let us know in the chat and say who you are. I see we have 42 participants. You can also write in the chat. It is as you like. Are there any questions? Are there any comments or proposals how to go on in Slovenia, in Europe? Or any additional comments from other of our partners? I would just like to mention that we also in this mission had the participation of the EBU, the European Broadcasting Union, and for the first time the Public Media Alliance, which is an organization also very much involved in promoting public service media throughout the world. And for us, it's very important because there are many studies who showed also during the pandemic, the stronger public service media and the more independent it is, the more trust and the better the media and journalist resilience is within the country. There is one, Uros is a question. Would you like to? Uros, please go ahead.
Okay, thanks. Hello, my name is Uros Kerl-Kramberger. I'm a journalist at Dnevnik newspaper here in Ljubljana. Mr. Schoot Uiterkamp, you mentioned that you call upon European institutions to support journalism in Slovenia. What concretely can be done by the political institutions of the EU? What would be the steps that EU could take?
Well, the last thing I mentioned, I think, is the most immediate and concrete, namely the anti-SLAPS directive. But for the rest, I think it's also important that European institutions stay vigilant and follow changes to media regulation imposed by the Slovenian government, and that they monitor whether these remain within the bounds of the rule of law conducive to media freedom, and that if necessary, the threat of rule of law procedures, if any red lines would be breached, is mentioned, even if only to make sure that media regulators are aware that there are red lines that are being monitored. So I think concretely the main threat when it comes to regulatory when it comes to regulations that would go against media freedom, the threat of rule of law, of new rule of law procedure is there. Otherwise, the anti-SLAPP directive and furthermore directives and actions by European institutions when it comes to meddling by the government in media ownership, in neutral allocation of government advertising, neutral allocation of government advertisements, which should have guidelines that the Slovenian government should stay within. I hope that was concrete enough.
Yes, yes, thank you, yes.
I may just add, I think we all know that there is a sort of dilemma when it comes to EU involvement in media issues. It's not for nothing that we have not been able to do enough when it comes to Poland and to Hungary. We all know about the Article 7 potential nuclear bomb. By the way, there is a question on that as well, which I come to in a second. And the frustration is faced by some of the commissioners in the actual Ursula von der Leyen commission as well. And that's why you may know a few months ago by now, both Commissioner Vera Jourova, who is responsible for transparency and also for media pluralism, and Thierry Breton, who is responsible for media from a more economical point of view, have announced a Media Freedom Act. And actually to get something more systematic to deal with the issues we are facing here today and in Slovenia, and by the way, in many other countries as well. This is a process. We will try to be involved in that to come up with some bold legislative procedure, but it's long lasting. It won't be, it may be something come out next year. It will take quite a while till we get a legislative framework, if ever we will, because you all know that media at the moment is very much at a subsidiarity level. It's very important for member states to keep it at that. So it will indeed be a challenge. But as Tim said, some things are happening, be it on SLAPP. We have been able to get a whistleblowers directive, which is also very, very important for journalists. The European Commission will come up with a recommendation on safety in the autumn, also something due to the increased attacks against journalists. It's all soft power, it's soft law, and it's not easy to get really something out for us. But assure us, we are all working on that, and we have some allies within the Commission. We have less allies within the member states. So it will be a long process, which leads me to, before I give the question to Klaus Pömpers, who asked for the floor, there is one question, sorry, this is by Klaus Pömpers. It's a question of Article 7 procedure. Do you think there are enough problems in Slovenia now to come up with Article 7? I personally do not think so, but if any of you would like to say a few words, thank you.
I would agree with your assessment that no, not yet, or no at the moment, and hopefully that doesn't mean not yet. And I think also picking up on the previous replies, like one of the things that the illiberal democracy playbook that has come up, something we've seen before in Poland and in Hungary, is that this is a very multi-pronged attack. During the Poland mission we did last year, an interlocutor described it as death by 1,000 cuts. And that's something also here that we would like the Commission and other European and international institutions to recognize, is that we're not talking about a big foul coup-like sweep where you then need to respond to one act and then we all move on. It's a lot of different things that are market manipulation, that is misuse of regulators, that is these Twitter attacks about which I spoke earlier. And there's a need also on the side of the European institutions to look at this holistically and to fight back at every corner and to not let small things slip by because it's politically inconvenient or because you know, there's no appetite to take it up for whatever reason. And there's a need for a holistic look and a comprehensive approach that fights back on all of these different fronts, both with the tools that are already at the disposal of the Commission and others, and as Renate mentioned, in the development potentially of new tools that fill these gaps where they currently exist. And hopefully if that's done, there won't be a need for Article 7, right? Because indeed it's the nuclear option and also difficult to implement, frankly. But besides that, it's just, let's hope it doesn't reach that point. By now, being diligent and you know, putting up a strong defense at every turn in the road and at every fork, trying to pick the right option rather than going along with the wrong one.
I just wanted to say what I also liked from a few people during the mission saying, we have to change in Slovenia. We need to change the government. It's in our task. And that is something I heard from our Slovenian colleagues, and I often do not hear from other countries. They always look at us to change everything, and they're only partly right, because it has to change first, foremost, in the country itself. We are only there to help, to monitor, and to try to put pressure on the Commission. But the most important battle, to use this language, remains in the country itself. I think Tim wanted to say something, and then I have a question from Yanis Marquez. So Tim, and then please Yanis Marquez.
I'd like to add to what you just mentioned with another positive point that we observed. So we've also had missions to Hungary, for instance, where one of the things that I very much remember as being said by some media professionals is that in the early stages of Orban rolling out his playbook, he was able to pick off media outlets, some of them at least, one by one. And when we this time spoke to Slovenian media professionals, there was among many of them an awareness of how that process had gone in Hungary, and a willingness to, at an early stage, which is where we are, at an early stage, show signs of solidarity and pushback. And I think that's an optimistic and important sign that is important to maintain. Solidarity within the independent journalistic community can make a huge difference to make sure that a power creep on the side of the government does not escalate.
Thank you. I have two more questions, but before, Yanis Marquez, please go ahead.
Team Laurens, Renate, and Jamie, that's not about question. It's about like a huge and big thank you, because your analysis is accurate, is thorough, and is in a paramount importance to us. And that's what I wanted to say instead of question. That's our fight. We have to fight it, and we are going to win it. That's no doubt about that. It's just a matter of time. But having you and having you behind us to watch our backs, and that's so important, you can't imagine. So that would be thank you for all, and stay with us. We're going to win it, no doubt about it. So thank you again.
We all need such comments like yours. It's very motivating for us, and be assured we're there with you and we help you, and a lot of force to you. I have a very interesting question from Domin Savic. I'll just read it. In regards to public funding of propaganda and fake news, do you see the Digital Service Act and the Code of Practice against disinformation positively influencing the situation you have witnessed in Slovenia? I can only start and say, in theory, yes, because I think one of the main objectives of the Digital Service Act is a better liability and a more transparent and forceful fight against disinformation. However, it's only a small part. It's dealing with online media. It will take a lot of time, but I don't think it would cover the whole scenario we have mentioned here, which is not only social media, which is not only the tweets by the Prime Minister, but it's media owner structures, self-censorship of journalists, public service media, and much more, all what we described. So we are working very much on a strong Digital Service Act to better fight disinformation indeed, but it's just a little part of the whole game. This is my answer to that. Would anybody else like to say something? Then I would give the second question to Krzysztof Bobinski from Poland. He asked a question on the implications of the situation on the EU decision-making bodies. I'm not exactly sure if I do understand the question. If you mean now the presidency and how I will act, I personally feel it will be all right. Also, I do think that the diplomatic apparatus of the Slovenian government is quite professional. Since Lisbon, the presidencies don't have such a power to change. They have more power of a moderating role. So I don't see any danger immediately, but of course we have to be very prudent. We never know if there is a secret agenda. So we have to follow it. I don't know if I answered your questions or if anybody else again has something to add on that. Okay, he says the question is about Orban having 3 votes in the Council and the Commission. Also, Hungary is heading the Council of Europe.
Isn't this a Balkan strategy by Orban, actually? Isn't Orban money in Slovenia? Isn't he looking to the Slovenian vote in the Council to support him and Poland when he comes to block things? And they will be trying to block the rule of law report, which is due to come out in July. So what you're saying is about Slovenia is very timely. This isn't the end. I don't think this will end on Slovenia. And we have to work very much together on helping the Slovenes to solve their problems, but also realize that this is part of a bigger picture. And also another question is, what can the EBU, the European Broadcasting Union, to do about this? Because all these public service broadcasters are members of the EBU, and can we support the EBU in trying to do something about this?
I'll give the floor to Tim and Laurens. I don't know if we have anybody from the EBU here. We all know, we had the question before, it's difficult for the EBU to deal with its members on these issues, but they are doing things. On the Czech Republic they did as well. They are working on it in a different way we can do, but I don't want to talk on their behalf. Tim, did you want to add something?
I'd like to respond to your first point. First of all, I think by saying that, first of all, I think you're really pointing out the sore spot thing here. We do see the influence not just of the model, the rhetoric of Orban-style politics in Hungary spreading to Slovenia, but also literally the influence of financing by media owners linked to the Hungarian government. That is, I think, what is the real significance. What is one of the real significances here is that Slovenia right now is an example and a warning sign of that this model of illiberal democracy and an illiberal approach to media freedom can spread when we do not address it, as has happened to Hungary over the last 10 years. So I think this is a sign that indeed, if we don't act Europe-wide against this particular way of looking at and treating media, then it's something that will just spread from one country to another. And indeed, I think your observation is correct that when last year there was, for instance, the discussion on the new emergency budget linked to COVID, and when that was linked to the rule of law procedure, that yes, that was the first instance where we saw the Slovenian government being the third country supporting Hungary and Poland in trying to block the rule of law procedure. So I think you're very much right that this is the influence of an Orban style government, but also of his government directly spreading to neighboring countries in order to strengthen his position at the European level.
I have two more questions, so we have to shorten up a little bit. I just wanted to add, of course, there are illiberal turns specifically from the so-called new member states, but we all know also about the coming together from the right-wing populist and Le Pen's and Salvini's and more, who have a slightly different but similar agenda. Question from Nabile Shabir. For those of us expat journalists in Slovenia, what more can we do to raise awareness and what is happening with the media sector here in layman's terms? Is there a strong civil society sector to join? Before we deal with this question, there was another question from Michael. If you could say what you wanted to say, and then we'll have a final round, please.
Yes, hello, my name is Michał Kokot. I'm the journalist of the Polish daily Gazeta Wyborcza from Warsaw. Thank you very much for this interesting report and for the conference. I would just like to give one brief comment and on the question, if you don't mind. The comment is about what you said, that I agree with you, of course, regarding what you said, that the countries have to change themselves, the law, the legislation, so people eventually have to change their governments. But I'm pretty sure about what you know about Hungary, that in this environment it's very difficult or almost impossible. If you think how much propaganda driven are the media there, that the legislation law has been changed and shaped to the ruling party, and given all of this, it will be really a tough challenge to change the government next year for the opposition. I think in this sense, Hungary is the very high stage, given the liberal democracy system, which allows only one party to win. Poland is on a medium stage. If we consider what happened a few months ago to the regional newspapers, which were bought by the state-owned Orlen, you reported also about that. And Slovenia, from what you are talking about, is on the early stage of this. My question also is about Slovenia and Hungary. You mentioned, Tim, that the situation there is like the Hungarian investors are going to buy some or already bought some Slovenian media. My question is whether the situation could be close to what we see in Hungary, where there was Keshma established, the foundation which from one day to another were transferred, sorry, almost 500 outlets, private ones. Do you foresee a similar or maybe scenario to Slovenia that it could be also possible to create a scenario like there where, thanks to the help of some Hungarian investors, the private independent media are becoming propaganda driven by SDS?
I propose, since it's 5 to 12, we have a last round with these two questions and maybe a last comment, and then we have unfortunately to finish this press conference. Maybe I start with Jamie.
Tim mentioned in his presentation that money is Hungarian capital is now being kind of channeled into media that are very close to the ruling SDS party. This has really increased over the last few years. And I think currently the amount of Hungarian capital in that market is still relatively small, but it's increasing. There are these outlets which are funded by media companies which are actually within KESMA. And it's them that are now being used as the pockets of this kind of media capture within Slovenia. But during the mission, we also heard that it's actually going one stage further now. And that the recent sale of a media company which owns Seal.net, which is a very well-read and influential media outlet in Slovenia, the company which owns this was being sold by the state-owned telecommunications company in Slovenia, Telekom. And that it's been reported a lot that this deal was then kind of withdrawn by Telecom after it emerged that the Hungarian bidder, which again is a company within Kejma, was outbid. And this has raised a lot of concerns about this kind of state-led manipulation of regulatory and kind of tendering processes to make sure that media are sold to the right buyer. And those companies that are standing there are Hungarian companies. In this case, the contract or the tender was taken back after United Group put a higher bid. But I think the risk is clear. So I think media capture, of course, happens very differently in different countries. We have the Hungarian example. In Poland, it's now the state-owned oil company, essentially. And in Slovenia, where the market is much smaller and there are less kind of big companies ready to step in and buy up media and then transform them into pro-government outlets. Instead, it's having to be cross-border financing. And I think the European Commission, our conversations with them, is aware of this and is looking into this. But indeed, this kind of spreading of Hungarian capital, both to Slovenia and to North Macedonia as well, is something to be really, really keeping an eye on and advocating on over the next few years.
Short, please, Laurens.
I'll address Nabila's question. So what more can be done to raise awareness of what's happening in layman's terms? I think it's two things, right? On the one hand, there's still clearly a need to explain more and to write more about the kind of problems that were very much in focus here today, and which are still poorly understood in other countries, but also with some European decision makers as well. The other thing I think what could be done is it's something that stood out during our fact-finding mission is there is so much interesting journalism going on within the country, really high quality investigative journalism, interesting community projects, interesting journalism that engages minority groups and so on and so forth. I think to create an understanding or a complete picture of what's happening, it will definitely help also if foreign media can link up, do joint projects and shine a spotlight on the quality, independent, critical journalism that is being produced in Slovenia, and to sort of put this on a pedestal and to show like this is what we're losing, right? If this plan is allowed to be put through, this would be what is getting lost. So I think sort of the combination of shining a spotlight on the problems and paying attention to the high quality journalism that would be lost, I think can be helpful to generate more awareness on this.
Tim, just a few last comments.
Yeah, I'd like to wholeheartedly support what Jamie and Laurens just said, especially Laurens's call to shine the spotlight and link with quality Slovenian media. And I think the one question that has not been fully addressed, can it go in the same direction? In theory, of course, yes, because the same rhetoric, the same logic is applied by the Prime Minister. In practice, the same type of power has not been consolidated yet at the political level. We all know that the SDS is in a not fully stable coalition government. So I think that the powers that Janša will have to implement that playbook will also be very dependent on next year's election.
I would also like to add again, even though it becomes political, I think it's very important that the EPP, the European People's Party in the European Parliament, understands what at risk. I heard from some MEPs who are really in our media freedom group, who are always advocating for media freedom, who now, when it comes to Slovenia, they are very prudent because Janša's party is part of the EPP. And we had exactly the same scenario already back to Berlusconi. You may remember the conflict of interest that he had, and we had it when it came to Hungary. We didn't have it as such when it came to Poland for political reasons. And I think this is really a shame. So we have to work on that. On the other point, I just want to also support exactly what you all said. And I can say that the European Commission now with its Creative Europe project, they're putting much more project money into EU collaborative projects, exactly, in shedding light and having maybe more digital startups working with other EU countries, comparing, to have more support at local level. For us, local media, local journalism is so important to support local democracy and democracy. We will have elections. We need also support to change the narrative. That's very important. We need, as we always say, media literacy, but it's true. The last year's media pluralism monitor, which is done by the Florence Institute, the ECPMF, was actually writing that Slovenia media literacy is a risky point. There is not enough. Just for information, the media pluralism Monitor 2021 will come out in July as well. So that will be another independent report done by academics that probably come up with similar results, with similar sets of recommendations or different ones. It will be very interesting for us. And it's yet another tool for you also to use at national level to say, hey, here are things we have to do. We won't stop from our side. And I personally appreciate very much this frank discussion with all of you. Most of you stayed to this very end, which shows that there is a lot of interest in the debate. And we all thank you. Thanks to Jamie, thanks to Laurens, thanks to Tim, and thanks to everybody who made this possible. Bye-bye, and we assure you, we try to be in Ljubljana in the autumn, be it online or hopefully in real. Bye, everybody. Bye-bye.